Thank you, Keith, for the welcome, and welcome again from me. And today is super significant because it is today, exactly 60 years ago, that 1961 Australian Grand Prix was held at Mallala. Already there are many stories bubbling around the room, some of which I hope you get to share or to hear. I'm certainly ears open. And the other thing I like is people have brought along photos and memorabilia programs and things from the past. So it's a very good idea to have these events now and then to, I guess, reminisce, but also flush out that very valuable material. And because a lot of the people we're going to talk about aren't with us anymore, we can also tell the odd, we can stretch things a wee bit. So my job, Bolter gave me this very arduous task of describing the car club's involvement in the Grand Prix between 1936 at Victor Harbour and 1961 at Mallala. So there were 5 in total. The club, of course, as you know, was founded in 1934, and already very soon after that we were talking about staging an Australian Grand Prix in South Australia. And we had to wrestle it from the Victorians because every Grand Prix from 1928 until Victor Harbour was held at Phillip Island. You probably know that, but this was a significant achievement. This little club, 2 years in, was able to run the Victor Harbour, the famous Victor Harbour Grand Prix. So interestingly, that was 85 years ago this year. So anyone here that was at Victor Harbour? They say they were. So it was also the state's centenary, 1936, and that was significant in that I guess the powers to be said, what are we going to do in this centenary year? Oh yeah, we'll have a Grand Prix. So it was another lever to wrestle it out of Victoria. They got it back eventually, of course, in 1996 or thereabouts. Now, something I didn't know, but I found this hidden away, is that there was a proposal to have a circuit near Wollonga. So Mark Scott and I on the way home are going to start working out where the hell that would have been and go and see if we can mark it out and resurrect it. But I did not know that. Did anyone else know that? That Wollonga was the first... Richard, you're here. That's 3 of us want to go and have a look. So... that was something I did not know. The other thing I didn't know was that the Premier of South Australia at the time, Premier Butler, he got very excited and he wanted to allocate £500 to the centenary Victor Harbour Grand Prix to bring out a team of Italian drivers. So just put yourself in that period. Nuvolari, Ferrari, Fagioli, Biondetti. Imagine if those guys had come out.
Well, no one else would have been able to pronounce their name.
Who did I miss there? Villaraci and Farina. So anyway, what happened is there was unrest overseas. Mussolini was, and by the way, have you seen that his granddaughter's coming to power? So let's not stage a race at Victor Harbour because the Italians won't be. Anyway, so that is a really interesting aside that we were forward thinking even in those days. The circuit at Victor Harbour was 7.25 miles, and I think most of you have an idea of where it ran. So those roads are still there. Sadly, the main corner has now a great big roundabout on it, and it's the same thing that's been done at Lobethal on Kyani Corner, by the way. And to me that's sad because the integrity of that original layout's just been quietly overrun. Now maybe the roundabouts are a good idea, but I'm sure that none of the authorities consulted history and said, hang on a minute, maybe we should think about this. So the Victor Harbour Grand Prix, I've got notes. The councils and the authorities got together. There was a hell of a lot of work done in a very short space of time. The road was a mix of dirt and bitumen. They poured some chemical compound on the dirt to keep the dust down. That more or less worked. In those days the races were handicaps, and so Les Murphy, famous Victorian, won the race in his MGP type. But There were some significant cars that came to that event, one being the ex-Prince Bearer K3MG, which the Brady family owned here in South Australia for over 50 years, but it was imported just before and ran at that meeting with Lord Walleran, who was a member of the nobility racing for Jon Snow, who was the beneficiary of a department store business in Sydney, and so he brought in a lot of important cars, both Victor Harbour and later Lobethal. I'll give you one little gem just to finish off on Victor Harbour. For £2.15 for a week, men could have 3 meals a day and sleeping facilities at the Port Elliot Showgrounds. They also had showers and electric lighting. Ladies, you weren't allowed in, sorry. Right, so we then moved to, I've got to keep this going, otherwise that 1.5 could come true. Lobethal followed, and Lobethal is a bit of a pet subject of mine, but there were 7 race meetings at Lobethal overall from 37 to 48. Of course, a few years ago we reenacted some of that, but the Australian Grand Prix was held January 2nd, 1939, right on the cusp of war breaking out. Lobethal is another one of these can-do stories where a group of businessmen who were spectators at Victor Harbour looked at each other and said, let's run one of these at Lobethal. And so a very short time later, the Lobethal circuit was, I don't know how they did it, it's quite inspirational that they went back to Lobethal, must have looked at a map or something and said, hey, we can lay out a racetrack. And Lobethal was and still is the longest ever circuit laid out in Australia at 8.75 miles or 14 point something kilometres. It was also able to deliver the highest speeds on a racetrack that had ever been seen in the country, so it was significant from a number of points of view. 22-year-old Alan Tomlinson came from West Australia in an MGTA that he engineered way beyond any specification that Lord Nuffield had ever dreamt of. Won again a handicap race, but he won it. According to him, he was touching 140 miles an hour in that little MG, which was supercharged and everything else had been done to it. So he also came with a team 3 weeks before the event. They walked and drove that whole circuit in bits. They did not do complete laps at high speed because they didn't want any opposition to work out how quick they were. They stayed in the pub in Woodside. They stole the dinner gong. All sorts of things happened. But Alan told me that a lot of the teams arrived the day before. So he'd been there 3 weeks, walking the circuit, driving it, learning it. Others arrived the day before. So he had a massive advantage and was incredibly clever about how they went about things. And also at that Grand Prix, some very significant cars. I go back to Jon Snow and people like that. So we had Alfa Romeo P3s, Monzas, Delahaye's, exotic cars that had not been seen on racetracks in Australia before. And I think they probably reacted to this idea of an 8.75 mile circuit would have been pretty compelling. When you think about Port Wakefield, which will come to being 1.3 miles, so chalk and cheese. There's a bit about the club here, of course, and the club was very front and centre at Lobethal. And dear old Ray Pank, who passed away not that long ago, and he's at 100, he was a competitor there and had many a story for me, which I still value. But one that I think is beautiful is that on New Year's Eve, so the race was on the 2nd of January, most of the competitors had arrived, some were probably still coming. New Year's Eve, the Sporting Car Club of South Australia held a dinner dance at the Hotel Adelaide for all the visiting drivers and their wives. There were 200 of them all up, so 3 times what we've got in the room here. But the beautiful bit was this cost the club £15. And it was considered an exercise well worth the outlay. A couple of other things about Lobethal. like the 61 AGP, the weather at Lobethal was stinking hot, so there was a lot of attrition through blown engines, tyres that disintegrated, drivers who were exhausted, you can imagine. And yet, they had, how about this, they had a crowd at the 39 AGP of 60,000. They all paid because they had to pre-buy tickets in the city, and the majority of them went to the track on the train, which ran along the Onkaparinga Valley east side, I suppose. The ballast for that track is still there. It's now the Amy Gillett cycling track mostly, but quite extraordinary. The population of the state then, I don't know, but it wouldn't have been much, and so damn near everybody was up there. There are only the people burgling their houses that were still down on the flat. And the ticket was 2 and 6pence. So that was Lobethal. Of course, there's much more we could say about it, but we've got to move on. Nuri Utpa, we need Peter Gers here to say this, but Nuri Utpa was January the 2nd, same date, in 1950. So again, there was this community concept of hosting a race meeting, and in 1948, Steve Tillett, car number 18, Steve Tillett spoke to John Hill Smith, who's part of the Yalumba family, and he posed the question, could the Barossa Valley host a car race? And I guess a further sweetener is, could they time it with the annual Barossa Vintage Festival? So they laid out a 3-mile, more or less rectangular circuit in the town, in and around the town of Newry. I'll say Newry from now on, it's a lot less of a track. And it was a joint proposal by the Sporting Car Club and the Motorcycle Club of South Australia. And it's significant again in this era that the car club and the motorcycle club worked very much hand in hand, and the meetings almost always ran cars and bikes. Lobethal, going back to that, would run the bikes one weekend, the cars were the following. But it was not uncommon for mixed meetings, and I think it's terrific that occasionally we still find the means of doing that. Anyway, Newry got to host the Australian Grand Prix in 1950, having had the first meeting in 1949. And again, the numbers are staggering. They had 35,000 spectators. It was a 2-stage format, so there was a handicap. This is the first time. There was a handicap and an outright winner. The handicap being, I guess, all the factors that were taken into account as to the slowest car versus the fastest car, and the outright performers quite often missed out totally on that handicap system. So Newry was the first major event where they covered both, and the handicap winner and the outright winner, who was the fastest, scored the same prize money. They ran 34 laps, or a total of 102 miles, and that event was won by the famous Black Bess, driven by Doug Whiteford. And there were a number of other significant entrants in that 1950 Grand Prix. And again, car 18 sitting behind me was one of those. So Newry was significant in that it was the last road race permitted in South Australia. So Lobethal segued into Woodside, which didn't host a national Grand Prix, and then Newry in 1950 was Grand Prix. After that, the law changed and road racing was banned. And a few of you will know that when we set about staging the Australian Grand Prix F1 version in 1985, somebody realised at some point, hang on, we've got a law in place that forbids road racing, so that had to be overturned.